Hi everyone, just before we get into this episode of Type 1 I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you so much for pressing play. I really hope you enjoy this episode. If you do, don't forget to hit subscribe and you'll be notified when new episodes come about. You can find us across podcast land on Spotify, iTunes, all those good places as well. Secondly, anything you hear on this podcast should not be taken as medical advice. I am, of course, not a professional, and you do need to seek advice from your healthcare team before making any changes to your diabetes management. And lastly, if you want to say hello, I do have an Instagram page specifically for the Type 1 podcast. You can find it at Studio Type 1 That's at Studio Type 1, the number, on 1, the number. And you can also come and say hello and follow me on my personal page, which is at Miss Jen Greaves. And all of that will be noted in the episode description. Hi everyone, and welcome to Type 1, a podcast that delves into the obscure, complex and challenging world of life with Type 1 diabetes. I'm Jen Greaves, and each week, with the help of some brilliant guests, I'll be showing that there is no normal when it comes to handling this whopper of a chronic condition, because we're all pretty much figuring out the messiness of day-to-day life with diabetes as we go. And most of all, even though it doesn't always feel like it, we are absolutely not alone. My guest today is Mel Stephenson-Gray. A long-standing member of the diabetes online community, Mel has really shown us what it means to live with type 1 diabetes throughout the years. From representing Wales as an athlete to dealing with more than one chronic condition to becoming a mum, retraining as a nutritionist, throughout it all, Mel has continued to spread awareness about the possibilities as well as the realities of living with type 1 diabetes with so much heart, setting up a peer support group for young people in Cardiff, becoming a charity trustee and advocating across the world. Mel was diagnosed with the condition at the age of 13. Hello, Mel.
Hi, thanks for having me.
No problem at all. It's so nice to see you. We've met in person a few times, but it's been a very long time, hasn't it?
It has. The time has just gone so quickly.
Yeah, I was saying, lots has changed for both of us, but actually diabetes is still there.
Yep, old faithful diabetes.
Never goes away. How is lovely Wales today? How are you doing?
Yeah, doing well, thank you. It's dry, it's sunny, but it's cold. But, it's that time of year, so we'll take it.
Yeah, and how are the Bee Gees behaving this morning?
Yes, I am on a hybrid closed loop pump. So I think that's one of the real benefits, is that you wake up in a good place, which then, as many people will know, starts your day off in a good place, and that has a huge impact on the rest of the day then. So yes, looking good, thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's amazing to hear. It just changes everything, doesn't it? When you wake up and you think, oh, I haven't had any alarms, or I haven't been guzzling juice or sweets at 4 a.m. It really sets you up much better for the next day, unsurprisingly so.
It really does. I mean, I had a hypo a couple of days ago in the night, and it was the first one I could remember having perhaps this year. And my husband just looked at me and said, gosh, it's been such a long time. And it was a nice feeling to think, oh, yeah, this isn't a regular occurrence. This is just a blip. And yeah, it's life-changing.
Amazing. Okay, so let's take it back to 13-year-old Mel, which was the time of your diagnosis, and certainly hybrid closed loops weren't really kicking about. So tell me a little bit about what life looked like for you. You're obviously going to school and things, but what was 13-year-old Mel's life like?
So, back then I was enjoying dance classes. So I was just doing those on a weekend, and I was in high school, hadn't long started, a couple of years in, so still kind of finding my feet, I suppose. And then the symptoms started. So toilet tired, thirsty, thinner, all just kind of hit and got worse, and particularly the fatigue was just, I remember that was something else. The thirst, just drinking whatever I could get my hands on, and waking up in the night, putting my head under the tap because that thirst is just so extreme, isn't it? So we didn't suspect diabetes, even though I've got it in the family. We just didn't really think about it. Um, and so went to the GP and then got the emergency call afterwards to head to the hospital where I was diagnosed then. So
Oh,
yeah, all a bit of a rush. No overnight stay though. Um, and my paediatric team came to visit me in the morning, and they started a wonderful relationship with them. They were the absolute best. I'd still be there now if I could be. And yeah, they got me in a really good place, I think, and that made a huge difference.
yeah, I do think those early interactions really set the tone, don't they? Because a lot of people are plunged in, whether child or adult, into something that they don't really know much about, usually a lot of the time. And so you really like, I sort of remember hanging on to the reassurance and the smiles because everything was so out of sync. Like I was suddenly in a hospital and I was suddenly talking to loads of adults and I was suddenly being spoken to a lot more maturely than normal. And so all of this stuff was being like thrust at me as well. And I do really remember clinging on to every word. And what I remember in my head was kind of a very reassuring tone, a very gentle tone. So do you think that sort of set you on a path in terms of your perspective? Because you've done so much with type 1 and you've always been very like as I said at the beginning, you've had so much heart in being aware of trying to help other young people as well. So do you think those early interactions played any part in that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was a huge influence because I think my diabetes nurses and my consultant were they were just they just were made different. I think they just had this really unique perspective. So I didn't stay in hospital that night because they were already doing research into kind of reducing the trauma of having that stay. And I think that kind of speaks to how deeply they considered that, that monumental moment of diagnosis. So it was them going into my school to talk to my teachers to kind of make sure that they set the tone there, that I wasn't to be excluded from any, say, physical activities. When I came to them 3 years after saying I wanted to do athletics, exactly as you say, that the tone was very much, yeah, let's work out how we do this safely, rather than a tone of, oh, that's going to mess your blood sugars up, or that's going to make it more difficult. Or there was always a positive tone, but there was also, in a really supportive way, they fostered an independence, but never an independence that I felt alone with. Just more, I think it was about handing back control after the lack of control of being diagnosed with this condition. So at 13, I started doing my injections myself. I've never had anybody else do my injections. And yeah, I think it's just helped me take ownership of my condition. And the more comfortable you feel with it, the more then perhaps you feel like you can speak about it and kind of talk to others about it, perhaps.
That's absolutely phenomenal. I think that's really helpful for people to hear as well, particularly if you've been plunged into it as a parent. It must be so hard to understand which way to go and what tone to take. And I think everything you've expressed there is incredible. And obviously, it will be individual for each child. But I can imagine just not having that flat out no with something like athletics, which I'm sure many people have been told. Like the reassurance that you can go out there and live your life, and whatever that may look like for you. As a child, you really are impressionable and you do listen to that stuff. So coming into athletics after your diagnosis, what prompted that? What sort of sparked your interest in the sport?
So in Wales, we've got a really good kind of development system. So in terms of the kind of the schools competitions, you start off in your local school, and they hold kind of like, for me, it was Cardiff and Vale, and so you just kind of go along and have a go. And because of those previous conversations that we were talking about, where I needed to be included in everything, then I went along and gave different sports a try and just found that I really like sprinting. And then kind of got, I suppose, kind of like supported towards a coach and a club. And then, not that I was particularly good at it at the beginning. I was kind of tall and gangly and a bit uncoordinated, but it didn't matter. It was just something that I could do, and it didn't negatively impact my diabetes. I think it positively did, because it really worked on my confidence and just giving me that mental break from diabetes as well, that you're doing something different. And sometimes I think with diabetes, there can be quite a focus on what your body is not doing. And athletics was a prime opportunity. Now I look back to realize that it was what my body could do. It was about ability and being able to just enjoy something as well.
Oh, I love that. And I think it speaks to sort of trying things out, whether it's art or music or sports. And I've found, and it took me much longer than you to realize, that actually the more I fill my life with purpose and passion and things that I love, the more meaning that my life has, and that's come through my career and connections and all, travel, all sorts of things. The tough bits about diabetes, which are always there, they're unrelenting, they sort of don't take over as much, because I've got this other stuff to kind of not only negate that a bit, but actually to motivate me to want to look after myself so that I can go out there and do these things and do a good job or travel the world or whatever it is. Like, does that resonate with you a bit as you've experienced things through your life?
Yeah, I think it does. And I think that's completely right, actually, that, the motivation sometimes was that I wanted to manage my diabetes really well for my athletics, or for my kind of long-term health, because I was putting so much in athletics wise and diabetes management wise. And I wanted to feel like I could get something really positive out of it the other end as well. So yeah, that's definitely relatable.
Cool. And a lot of people are very nervous around sport, around trying things for the first time with type 1, understandably so. Was there ever a question of whether you would be able to do this as the discipline grew, as your ability grew, as the time you were dedicating to it grew? What were the challenges that you faced as someone living with type 1 diabetes, and how did you kind of approach them so that you could continue, just to kind of spread that message to people listening as well, who might understandably be nervous to take up any kind of activity?
Yeah, I mean, it is very difficult, the prospect of kind of starting a new sport, because I think many of us appreciate that diabetes doesn't love variables. So when we add variables in, like sport, like activity, like the balance of all that, our diabetes kind of says, "Oh, hold on, wait a minute." However, for me, the benefits outweigh the potential negatives. Of course, there were huge stumbling blocks along the way. So I started off, when I did athletics initially, I started off on injections, but became very insulin resistant. So I had to swap over to an insulin pump, which the sport really complicated.
Mm.
And so the hospital team at the time did their best, but we were in new territory. There weren't people with insulin pumps at that level of sport. And so trying to get my basal rates right and that kind of stuff took a really long time. But thankfully, we're not in that position anymore. I think as well, um, I really did my best to take responsibility for my diabetes. So I was in a training group without other people with diabetes for a very, very long time. And so my coach treated me in the best way. He treated me like everybody else. So I kind of knew that it was my responsibility to get to the track and to do the sport by preparing ahead of time. So I think I would have felt a sense of kind of, it would have been quite challenging if I hadn't looked after my diabetes and I was constantly hypoing or just constantly not in a good place. I wouldn't have enjoyed the training so much. So I really tried to take that on, and I never felt overwhelmed by it, I don't think. But yeah, I just wanted to make sure that I could put myself in a good place to manage the condition. But that was the other side of things, that there wasn't a lot of kind of nutritional knowledge again about that level of sport and managing type 1 diabetes at that time. So I travelled from Wales to High Wycombe and beyond to try and find the experts, and my knowledge became an amalgamation of everything that I learned. So nothing wrong with that, but it was learning it the hard way. I can definitely say that.
Yeah. And obviously we're talking about a very high level of sports, but I think for a lot of people that is kind of how you learn, isn't it? It's trying, realizing it didn't quite go to plan, and tweaking and trying again, and that's all we can do. So yeah, that's, I think, reassuring in a way, that there is no magical kind of, here you go, this is going to go wonderfully. And actually the key is in the planning, so that you can adapt as things change, or as your body responds to what you're doing.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's knowing your stuff. So, kind of knowing about the sport and the impact that the blood glucose levels have, learning and understanding about insulin on board, because that's what causes the hypos whilst you're doing it. And then learning about the different types of carbohydrates. So, you don't need one particular type of carbohydrate all the time. Sometimes it changes. And so I think having that knowledge, I was having more of the kind of slower acting carbs at the beginning of the day where I was training in the evening, but coming up to the sport, I would have more of the faster acting carbs towards using it for energy. But one of the things that I've realized, kind of stepping further back, is that in a way, athletics was easier to manage because it had that routine. So, where I was training 6 days a week, I'm not suggesting that everybody needs to do that, but actually, it's a lot harder when you go from doing no activity to one day, nothing one day. Your body does seem to adapt to that routine. So, I think making physical activity a regular part of kind of, life, my personal opinion is that it's easier than ad hoc.
Yeah. And on a very basic level of sporting prowess, I have found the same. Like, if I get into a consistent routine, my body seems to respond a lot more as I would expect it to. And like, my general insulin requirements like will drop a little bit over the longer term, rather than, yeah, like you say, it being this like one time thing. But I can see how people naturally, when you start, you would do it once to see what happens, and then maybe have a bit of a pause or a break. And it's hard to fit regular exercise into busy lives and stuff. But like you, for me, it's worth it, to be honest. Like, I found it to be a real key piece in also the mental load of type 1 as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely. I think that we're still not really at a point where we fully understand and support the mental load of living with diabetes, I don't think, and all of the psychology that comes with it. I'm still a huge advocate that I would like psychology to be a much greater part of diabetes care, particularly for adults. I think we're moving towards a good place for children, but for adults, we really need an awful lot more.
Yeah. And for yourself, obviously, when you're trying to discover all this, like you said, you physically traveled to get the information, whereas now there's a lot more out there online. But what was it that inspired you to go from taking on this information and finding it out for yourself, and you're still very young at this point, to being inspired to start speaking out, to start working with peer support groups and setting up your own peer support group? What was it that you saw that you wanted to kind of, that motivated you to want to get in there and try and help?
It was the difficulty in finding the information, and that realization that people were still finding it just as difficult, and that it was becoming a barrier to feeling confident in doing physical activity. So when I had that difficult transition from injections to insulin pump, I'd not long won a British medal. So I got in touch with Diabetes UK and kind of said, this is where I am. I had to kind of have a break from uni, so I had the time on my hands to commit to volunteering, and just kind of went to them and said, how can I help? This is, who I am, what I do, like, where can I support you, type of thing. And so that was a really positive experience, because, as you say, I think it kind of shifted the focus from me feeling about my diabetes not behaving itself to kind of starting to look at this much bigger picture. And so that started off as things like promoting more of a positive image of diabetes, because at the time, the media weren't always very kind about the way they spoke about diabetes. There was a lot of stigma, there was a lot of blame, and that wasn't the diabetes that I knew. Diabetes was, my driving force for why I wanted to do athletics. So it was kind of rewriting the story on that. And then as the years kind of went on and kind of did more volunteering, say family days, or kind of speaking at conferences, I just felt like I wanted to make that journey a little bit easier. So decided to retrain as a dietitian then.
Yes. And what years are we talking about here? Like, what's the timeline of this?
So I did my first degree in design, which I graduated from in 2010. And then I worked for a couple of years and was training full time as well. And then in 2014, I went back to college and did, because my A levels had been in more kind of art based and design based subjects. I went back and did my chemistry and biochemistry and biology A levels. Which were no mean feat, because it was quite an intensive course as well. You do the 3 A levels in 9 months. But there is something about being an adult student that makes you incredibly well driven, and you know what you've given up to kind of to go along this path. So, that was absolutely fine. And then managed to get onto the dietetics course in Cardiff, and then graduated from that in 2018.
Wow, incredible. I do think people with type 1 diabetes are jugglers, but you really are a phenomenal multitasker. And as I said, you've always just had this calming energy about you. Like, when I've met you in person once or twice along the kind of advocacy road, I've always come away thinking, I need to be a bit more Mel. Like, you're just so soothing. You're so I'm so impressed. And I remember, like, I think seeing online that you were retraining and stuff, and even when you say the words chemistry, like, I shiver, because I just do not have a science brain. It's amazing. So what did that give you? What did you find when you started to actually dig into this, having been motivated by your own condition and the lack of information that was out there? What were the good things that you found, and what were the sort of maybe more frustrating pieces, I guess, that you're now kind of able to be in the system with? But I'm curious as to what you kind of uncovered. It's very different being from the outside and looking in.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, actually. So I work in diabetes prevention now, and I've also worked in type 2 diabetes and weight management. And it has been an incredibly interesting path, because I thought I would end up in pediatric diabetes, because I wanted to give people that, that wonderful head start that I got given myself. But the passion has just kind of driven me to where I am for the moment. And I think oh gosh, it has been a huge learning curve. So hopefully my colleagues find it interesting having somebody living with diabetes in their team. So quite often we've got the evidence base, which is incredibly important, but I'll also give that patient perspective, because sometimes assumptions can be made. Say a referral says that somebody is not controlling their diabetes, usually my perspective will be, it's not that somebody's not controlling it, it's that they haven't got the tools to manage it. And so as I kind of teach students and I kind of make resources, I try and convey both sides of the coin, as it were, that it's not at all that people don't care about their diabetes. And I'm not saying that that's what people have outwardly said, but I want people to know that diabetes is such a complex condition to manage that as healthcare professionals, we've got this wonderful opportunity to give people the tools that they can manage it themselves, that we don't need to be the gatekeepers of everything. Um, some of the other things that I've learned are that, well, I kind of had an idea of this, but I don't think I understood the degree. But the way that diabetes disproportionately impacts people of ethnicity and how few resources there are out there to kind of to support people. So I've worked on things. So I think that's probably the other thing, is that these ideas kind of come into my head of what I would want if I was in that position. So for example, I've made a series of Eat Well guides for diverse communities. So an Arabic one, South Asian one, um, Eastern Asian one, because I think that nutrition and education should be an opportunity for everybody. And that's what we mean really when we're talking about health equity. So that everybody has the same opportunity, and that might require different resources, but that's okay. So, yeah, I'm still continuing to learn, and that's why I love diabetes prevention so much, because I remember saying in the interview for the job that nobody would be more motivated in supporting people towards preventing diabetes than somebody with the condition already. So I hope that that's something that, I've been in the role for nearly 3 years, and I'm just continuing to carry through, that the level of motivation when you're living with the condition and supporting people with type 2 is high.
Yeah, incredible. And how has that been met? Like, how do you see this shifting, and what more can be done from within, from the healthcare systems?
I think I'm very, very lucky that I've got what we sometimes call a type 0 boss. So she's somebody who doesn't live with diabetes, but she completely and utterly gets it. And I wouldn't have been able to work on these, special projects if, well, if I hadn't had her support and she didn't have that kind of foresight that these are really important things that we do need. So I think that's been a huge part of it. I think there's still a lot of work to be done, because I think that in the early days, I don't know whether it was considered a benefit to have somebody living with diabetes and working in the condition. I don't know whether people felt that there was a kind of conflict there or not. So a few times I've kind of explained that I've lived with the condition for nearly 25 years. There's me as myself, and then there's me as a healthcare professional, and what's appropriate flows between the two, and what needs to stay separate stays separate, because we've all got different parts of ourselves. So the tide is definitely turning, I think.
And is it education that you see as the biggest challenge for people who you treat, who you work with? Like, what's the biggest frustration? What is it that people find the most challenging to get to grips with when it comes to their own health?
I think it is. Now, obviously, I'm talking about pre-diabetes and type 2 diabetes, but it is that access to education. So sometimes you'll meet people who've lived with diabetes 25 years, they've never had education, they've never met anybody else living with a condition. And the question is, how do we expect people to manage the condition if they haven't been given the tools to do so? So I think that extends to technology as well for those who need it, that it can be a really, really powerful tool. Because even though I deliver education, I do encourage people towards technology, because there's something along the lines of just seeing how your blood glucose levels respond in CGM to carbohydrates and the different demands of the day just really cements what's being said in terms of education. So yeah, so I would say access to education and technology. But I think, as I say, things are absolutely moving in the right direction. And I've noticed with pre-diabetes as well, how much people so greatly appreciate the opportunity for those warning signs that, they're being told that things are moving in that direction. They're really kind of receptive and really highly motivated. It's a wonderful service to work in. It really is. So yeah.
Oh, I'm so happy that you found a thing, especially after something so, focused and dedicated as sport. It's such a big part of your life to then be able to move into something that you feel passionate about in a different way. That's amazing to hear. And I can see you kind of smiling as you're talking and the difference you're making, I'm sure, is incredible. What has it done for you in terms of opening your eyes to the understanding? Because, I think we can see that there are stigmas surrounding all types of diabetes. And often we're in the type 1 community, I think I wouldn't be wrong in saying that we try and keep it very separate from type 2. But how has that kind of opened your eyes to the stigmas that are out there for people with type 2 and, the narratives that need to be changed around that?
There are significant stigmas, and what probably upsets me the most is that obviously the stigma is not correct, but it's so widespread that people start to kind of they bring it with them. People take it on when they're diagnosed and they bring it with them, and that's so detrimental to kind of their own well-being. So yeah, it's definitely something to battle, and I think that it's really helped me coming from the weight management service and working with a psychologist and the way that we work in weight management. It's not straightforward, and not every case by any stretch of the imagination in type 2 is related to weight. And so it's not helpful having these narratives and these kind of stereotypes whatsoever. And I think it's kind of a bit disempowering as well, that when the stigma and the stereotypes are so strong, I would never want people to feel like this is so out of their control that, there's nothing that they can do to manage it. We see so many success stories that, yeah, it's really, really detrimental. It's really not helpful to people at all. And I think as well, it's been an interesting journey, because I didn't know when I started with type 2, would I start to kind of look at all kind of different types of diabetes the same, or like where would I go thought process wise? But actually, working in type 2 and living with type 1, it's cemented how important it is to know your type. And that's not because one type is more serious or than another type. It's that if you don't know your type, how can you use the best tools to manage it? And so I think that's been an important thing. And I think that thought has really developed, for example, where we start to learn more about the different types of diabetes and the nuances. I would give the example of MODY. I had a fantastic talk that I was privy to the other day, kind of understanding, for example, knowing that there are more versions of MODY and that each one has specific treatments that work better with it. That's better for the patient. It's better for the person living with diabetes. So it's been a real learning curve.
Wow. It sounds like this sort of individualized care piece is quite important. Would you say that's correct?
Yeah, hugely important. As far down as we can go. But as we always say, knowledge is power with diabetes. And the more you know about your type, then the better off I think you'll be.
This episode of Type 101 is sponsored by Dexcom. I've been using the Dexcom continuous glucose monitor for years, and it's hard for me to express just how much of a difference it's made to my life as someone living with type 1 diabetes. Their CGM sensors give me the confidence to make informed treatment decisions in the moment, which is great for me as I'm often running around, and with just a quick glance I can see exactly where my glucose level is, where it's been, and where it's headed. So please take a look at dexcom.com. They have a choice of systems, so you can find the right one for your lifestyle. So what do you think are some of the biggest things you've learned from the advocacy over the years, how it's changed, how the technology's changed, and how people speak about diabetes, that has also changed? So what have been the biggest kind of takeaways for you personally, but also in how we can best advocate to affect change from the companies that provide us with these tools and the education?
Oh, so I think along the years, it's really helped me personally to see the breadth and spread of the community with diabetes. I can't imagine being without the community, because diabetes can be such an isolating condition. And so to have that kind of daily support and check-ins and humour, and it's just made the world of difference, because I think so many people would say that they feel alone when they're diagnosed with a condition, but then to discover there's this whole community. And so I've been really, really fortunate that through my previous blog and social media, that when I've gone to kind of blogger events and social media events, kind of getting to see that global perspective then has just been absolutely phenomenal. And it's been very humbling as well, because diabetes is not managed or considered the same way in different countries as it is in the UK. Of course, we have our own challenges, but there are also significant challenges elsewhere. And so that's been, as I say, that's been very, very humbling to kind of to see and understand, and most importantly, hear that I've done my best to kind of to listen as much as I speak when I go and kind of talk at conferences and meet different people, because there's a lot to kind of learn from each other, as cliche as it sounds. I think in terms of speaking to the big companies that manage diabetes, I think there are huge positives, because when I was diagnosed nearly 25 years ago, I could not imagine being on the technology that I'm on now. And this is something that I've so consistently said, that technology and advancements brings hope. Because when I was diagnosed, and I was grateful for my insulin pens, but I had a blood glucose monitor that took an age. I had insulin that, of course, was keeping me alive, but it didn't act very quickly and it was quite unpredictable. So I say that it gives an element of hope, because how diabetes is now, even if you're diagnosed today, is not how diabetes will be in 5 years' time. And whilst we kind of all have that thing that regardless of when we were diagnosed, we were all told to be a cure in 5 to 10 years, um, technology is what brings that hope in the interim period until that point. I do think we're closer to a cure than we've ever been. And I do think that it will happen. When? I don't know, but I do think we're a lot closer. But I think as well, with regards to the kind of the pharma companies, that it's about having open conversations. It's about saying, this is what we need as a community. This is what we would like. We do like this. We don't like that. And I think the majority, in my experience, have been open to listening, because who doesn't want to listen to their stakeholders? It just makes complete and utter sense. And so I think it's kind of being confident enough as a community to share our thoughts and opinions in a constructive way.
That's so pertinent. I think when we first met was actually in the early stages of these conversations. This had never happened before, where pharma companies were opening their doors to people living with the conditions that the products they were making were serving. And I would agree with you that after some initial hesitations, because it's medical and it's scary and the regulations are quite rightly so tight, that the value of those conversations was very clear, and I always felt like they were received very openly. So yeah, it's interesting that you say that, and like you say, like being where we're at today versus where we were 20 years ago is just unbelievable to think about, which, like you say, gives me hope for what might happen in the next 5, 10, 15 years. And I just want to touch on what you said earlier about how at first the pump was quite difficult for you. And I know it was in relation to, very high level sport, which is not the case for most people. But what made you persevere with it? What kept you going with the technology when, you found it quite difficult at first to get to grips with?
Um, it kind of sounds a bit dramatic now, but it wasn't at the time. That this was, I had no choice. I needed it to work because of the insulin resistance. I really needed a better tool to be able to manage my diabetes. Otherwise, I was going to be in the realms of complications. And I just, understandably did not want that. The other reasons I didn't get on with an insulin pump initially were that my first one wasn't waterproof, and I used to train outdoors. And when I was indoors, I was doing circuits training, which is not pretty, but I'm not there to look pretty. It's sweaty, and so there was a lot of fear around that, kind of those type of things as well. But I think, yeah, the technology advanced, fortunately for me, fairly rapidly. So I was able to move to a waterproof pump. The cannulas got better as well, because in the early days, the insulin pumps used to block a lot and used to alarm a lot, I found. And so that was quite, talk about alarm fatigue. It was, it was real. It was really strong. So yeah, that desire to kind of to put my health and my body, because we've been diagnosed with diabetes doesn't mean that we can't be healthy people, which sometimes people kind of feel it is a bit of a conflict when I say that. But I think we can to the best of our ability. And I felt like I wasn't able to live a healthy life and I was going to have serious repercussions if I didn't get things sorted. So, yeah, it was just a real drive to to kind of for my future, really.
That's incredible to hear, because I was so in the moment with my diabetes, and it wasn't until complications did start to creep in that I was realized, and I don't hold any kind of guilt or shame around that, because I didn't know any better. I was working with the tools I had. The tone was set back when I was diagnosed, and I just carried on. And obviously the thinking and the education and the knowledge evolved, but I didn't really, because I was just getting on with my life. But it was complications that made me stop and realize that I had to take a bit more responsibility, or I had a responsibility to dive into my health needs to prevent them from developing further. So it's very mature of you. I can see the insight, like the sort of vision that you had for yourself and your health. I'm not in the same place I was 25 years ago, obviously, or even 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago. But I think if I'd looked back at any of those points at me sat here now, I would have thought, oh my gosh, I can't do that. That's too many changes. It's too many things. It's a lot of technology. And actually, I'm really quite proud of that journey, but it's one step at a time, isn't it? So
Absolutely.
maybe looking at tech and just seeing how it feels to have the conversation. And you don't have to change absolutely everything overnight, because it's a lot of information. Is that something you've seen with the people that you work with, where you're just trying to introduce things for people who have not used tech previously or didn't have the education around nutrition? How do you kind of approach that in the work that you do?
I think if I was to speak honestly, I put myself in their position. That how would I feel if I've experienced it. How would I feel if I've just got this new diagnosis? It's a complete overwhelm of emotions and information. How would I want to receive that? What would stick with me? What would flutter out of my mind? And I just put myself in their position and then translate that into the tools that are at my disposal to provide. So whether that is a resource or making something visual or making something that somebody can access when they go home, it's meeting people where they are. And I think for me, as for many of us, I've experienced that overwhelm with diabetes that, oh my gosh, there is so much going on. My body is not behaving in the way that I want it to. The technology is or is not my friend at this point. And it's that, I think you learn it in the early days, that it's that day by day, that it can be with diabetes. despite the kind of example that I've just given about worrying about my future complications, I do think it is a day by day kind of condition where you're just managing what's in front of you, because sometimes just a day can feel overwhelming, let alone looking years ahead. And I think perhaps, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but we're able to look years ahead now because we've had the condition for so long. Whereas if we were newly diagnosed, I probably couldn't see beyond the end of the year in terms of what my diabetes would look like. So it's taking your time with it.
Yeah. And I think particularly in the case of childhood diagnosis as well, the life that you've lived is quite small. So thinking, decades ahead, it's just not something that you do as a child. And you sort of do as you're told with what's in front of you. It's quite a short-term existence in that way, isn't it? That served me really well at first. So, it was only sort of over a decade in really where I sort of realized I'd kind of not course corrected maybe as I could have along the way. And again, I think it's maybe to do with the time that it was, and we didn't have the internet and information at our disposal and community, which is probably where we both came into it, doing this work, because we didn't have people around us to share this information with. And that speaks to, how far we've come really, which is amazing. I want to talk a little bit with that in mind about support systems, if I can. So I'd love to hear, first of all, how your family approached this because you were diagnosed as a child, like what those conversations were like, and whether they took the lead of that tone that was set by your healthcare team, especially around dedicating yourself to something like athletics. Like, what were the kind of interactions like in your household as you moved through your teenage years around the type 1? How did you approach that? Do you remember?
Yeah, I think I was very fortunate, I'm sure by design, that my parents did absolutely take on the tone, particularly my mum, I don't think you can, or it becomes very, very, very difficult to do high level sport without the support of your parents. And so my mum was obviously helping me manage an additional thing. And so yeah, I think that just kind of being open to opportunities. My mum never kind of held me back in any way in kind of saying, oh, you need to be cautious about that, or you need to think twice about it. She particularly made sure that I was never apologetic about my diabetes, which I cannot put enough emphasis on. So for example, she would never say, if we were eating a meal with friends or family, she would never say that I needed to excuse myself to do my injections, or that I needed to hide my diabetes, or that I needed to keep it a secret from anybody. And so I think that really built my confidence with how I perceived my diabetes then. And over the years, I've noticed that kind of very much people take their cue from you. So if you're unashamed, and as you should be, about your diabetes, and if you feel like you can be open and honest about it, I found that the response is inquisitive, but never kind of, I haven't had many negative experiences. So again, I think, yeah, it got me off to a really good place.
There's a lot to be said for that, isn't there? That's a really good takeaway for people as well. And let's talk about Will, if that's okay, your lovely husband who's been through this for a long time with you. So, how, I don't know if it's possible to articulate, but can you articulate what that support means to you?
I think when I met Will, not to sound dramatic, but I think the face aligned, because as well as him as a person, his experience of diabetes. So he had a great grandmother with type 1, and he's also got an uncle with type 1. And so kind of him having that background knowledge, he'd always grown up with his uncle. So he just had this appreciation for diabetes and how hard people work. And he saw me for me from the very, very beginning, but that included the diabetes as well. And he takes every opportunity to kind of to support and be helpful. Like, I couldn't have done my pregnancy without him. He became my chef. He became my complete support network, because it was COVID times as well. I just can't imagine, being with somebody who wasn't kind of supportive and motivated. And he's never blamed the diabetes for anything. He's never shown any frustration that if we've got to sit down when we're doing something interesting, or if the diabetes is causing frustration or whatever it is, he never, ever, ever takes anything out on it. So I don't feel any guilt about the diabetes then. So I'm very lucky.
Oh, yay, Will. Love to hear it. That's so lovely. Just touching on pregnancy quickly, because it's obviously a huge topic and we could probably do an episode in itself. But I can imagine that you tried to gather as much information as possible around pregnancy, but there's only so much you can prepare for, whether you live with type 1 or not. So what were kind of some of the biggest surprises for you as you moved through your pregnancy with type 1 diabetes?
There were a couple. So the thing that I couldn't anticipate what it would feel like until I was in that position was the insulin resistance. That you think, okay, yeah, managing my carb counting really tightly, managing my insulin really, really tightly with this, that's fine. But the insulin resistance is just this huge other variable that adds this significant element of predictability, and it just grows as the pregnancy goes on as well. So you're just kind of like, you think you're on an even keel for a couple of days, and then the insulin resistance will ramp up because it ramps up every trimester, and then it just kind of drops out of nowhere towards kind of the end of the pregnancy. So that was really significant. I would also say that I probably got to about 32 weeks pregnant and realized that I hadn't really read anything about just straightforward pregnancy, that everything I'd been looking at and focusing on was diabetes and pregnancy related. So I remember kind of picking up a book in a charity shop. It was a really good one, written by a midwife, because I was like, oh my gosh, I actually need to look at just general pregnancy stuff as well, because it just hadn't occurred to me, because I prepared that it was going to be hard and the diabetes was going to make it difficult, that I kind of forgot that it was also kind of like, it wasn't just a diabetes pregnancy, it was a pregnancy in its own right, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it makes so much sense, because this thing is so constant in our head and it's ever present, isn't it? I think it's the main concern when we're doing things, and I can totally see how that would happen. So how is life as a mum? Talk to me a bit about about your lovely daughter.
It's the best thing in the world. I mean, I think I have to balance everything. We had a really rocky start. So I had eclampsia after I had her. So that was really, really scary, and experienced quite a bit of diabetes burnout afterwards, because recovering from such a life-threatening event, and then the diabetes saying, well, you still need to think about me, and trying to breastfeed was hard, really, really hard. But she was 110% worth it. It's just a huge joy, and um, it's just lovely. She's in her princess era. I'm here for it. She does football at the same time. She's just an absolute joy. And as she starts to kind of develop her own personality, it's really lovely. She takes the diabetes in her stride. We've had a few conversations around insulin pump not being a Tamagotchi. But it does light up and it does make noises. So in fairness to her, no, we don't play with mummy's pump. So she's been very good, very, very good about it. It's been a hard journey for her as well, because her risk of developing diabetes is very high. So we've engaged in some of the phenomenal studies that have been become available. We're really lucky in Cardiff that one of them was the Enodia study was available. So kind of trying to identify her risk of going on to develop diabetes. And honestly, I can't say how grateful I am for it, because I've noticed as a parent with type 1 diabetes myself, when babies get ill or toddlers get ill, they do drink more, or they might wee more, or they might lose a tiny bit of weight if they're not able to kind of eat as much. And my mind just used to go straight to the type 1 diabetes. So even though we're still aware of that, having done this study to look at her likelihood, it's just bought us time, not kind of panicking every time she's unwell. And so that's quite difficult though, because the study involved a finger prick test. And so when she sees my finger prick test now, she says, "Oh, mummy, not me." And so that kind of breaks me a little bit, because she's had to go through that because of my diabetes, but we're trying to keep her safe.
Yeah. And ultimately that is the most important thing. Thank you for sharing that. I think that's a really special and powerful insight into sort of the things that you're thinking about and dealing with as a person with type 1 with children. So thank you so much, because that's a lot for you as well as your own condition, of course.
Living with type 1 diabetes as a parent is incredibly challenging, in a way that I perhaps couldn't have related to before. So I had a lovely friend that I or I was on the maternity ward with, and she was having her second baby. And she was really generous in kind of explaining to me that because we feel perhaps that our type 1 was diagnosed so suddenly, we're so mindful about our children being diagnosed with type 1 as well. And whilst people say to us, "Oh, your child will be in a good position because you know all about the condition," it's still not something that we would wish on our children. We just want them to kind of, not have that additional worry and additional stress. So when the time came then that this study came up, because we have such a significant family history of diabetes, all types in my family, I was just so grateful, because we were worrying every time that the baby was poorly, we were worrying that she was going to get type 1. And so this study, because she wasn't old enough at the time to do the ELSA study, was brilliant, because the results told you that the probability of her going on to develop type 1 diabetes before the age of 10 was absolutely minuscule. And the weight that lifted off then, just knowing when she's thirsty, she's just thirsty. And when she needs an extra wee, that just is what it is, type of thing. I can't even begin to describe, because we were, both me and my husband and my parents as well as grandparents, having raised me with type 1, we were all so mindful about type 1 rearing its head again. So again, this is a technology that I couldn't even when I was pregnant, I didn't know that this technology and this study existed. So I'm so grateful.
Can other people access that technology in that study? Do you
So
know?
I believe that the information for Inodia is online. There are different sites for it around the country. So we were lucky that one of those sites was Cardiff. But I believe that over the age of 3, the ELSA study is the one that, incredible work is being done on that. So I would imagine that majority of healthcare professionals are aware of it, but there's also a lot of information online, Diabetes UK website about that. And I completely understand if parents are feeling a little bit hesitant about their children being involved in clinical studies, because it probably feels like, oh gosh, what does that mean? And will they kind of be afraid of it? And so many questions. But it wasn't hugely invasive at all. As I say, she needed to give blood, which she was able to understand. And the healthcare professionals involved in the study, they treated her like a princess. They had a colouring book ready for her, a sticker, because anybody who knows, if you've got an under 3-year-old, stickers are everything. They were so well prepared, and it wasn't a scary environment. It was a really open and friendly environment. They allowed me, my husband and granddad all to be there. So it was really tailored to having a positive experience, if that's, a way to describe it. So, and what we got out of it was just so valuable. Plus, it will add to the body of evidence as well. So, that's something that I'm very mindful of, that the more information and evidence that we have, the more healthcare professionals can do with the treatments and preventative strategies as well, which we may all benefit from in the future.
Oh, that is incredibly valuable to have put out there. And I will try and find those studies to get them in the description below if people are curious, because that must be, I mean, I don't have children, but I've thought about it in relation to the questions around having children, for sure, as someone living with type 1 diabetes. So I cannot thank you enough for expressing that, because I know there are a lot of people who probably have the same considerations, fears, concerns, and I'm so happy to hear that it's kind of taken a bit of a weight off for you as well.
Oh yeah, it is. And we know that it might not be forever. They shall have to have it repeated in, say, 10 years' time. And of course we still keep a gentle eye, but it's not the panic that it was before, because children do get poorly. But every time we would get we would go to see the GP or what have you, I'd be saying, "Oh, what do you think? Type 1 diabetes? We've got this family history." And I don't want her to become, worried about it herself, of course. So yeah, it's taken a lot of that away.
Incredible. You are the ultimate juggler and so gracious with it all as well. And you're helping so many people through work, through advocacy, through all of it. And I'm incredibly grateful for this conversation. Thank you. Where can people find you if they want to say hello?
So I'm on social media. You'll mostly find me on Instagram. So Life Sport Diabetes. As you say, do come and say hello. Feel free to share your experiences of diabetes. It's lovely to kind of, connect with new people on there. So it's just a kind of like daily look of diabetes and the things that I'm doing with it, really, whether I'm at a trustee meeting one day or I'm kind of out running the next day, whatever it is, that it's kind of just sharing what's possible with diabetes.
Love that. I just said it all, but thank you so much. That kind of insight and discussing your lived experience is just very valuable. So I'm grateful to you for sharing.
Oh no, thank you for having me. It's been wonderful. It's lovely to kind of reconnect with you, and also to kind of just be able to kind of, what you're doing is building the community up, that you're showing different facets of this condition that we all live with. And I think that's so important.
Well, thank you for everything. Again, so nice to catch up after all this time.
Definitely.
What a lovely thing. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Type 1 Please remember that nothing you hear on this podcast should be taken as medical advice. I'm definitely not a healthcare professional. If you like what you hear, hit subscribe and do leave a little review on iTunes if you have time. It really helps to spread the word about type 1 diabetes. And thank you so much for listening.